It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the Gigabyte M27UP. As usual for a video, what you see depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software and by YouTube, and ultimately, and very importantly, it depends on the screen that you're actually viewing the video on, so it doesn't accurately represent what you'd see firsthand using the monitor. You'll find a link to additional content as well as information about how you can support the work that we do in the video description. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they're nice ways of showing your support. This monitor uses a 27-inch 4K UHD, that's 3840 by 2160 IPS panel, more specifically an LG Display IPS panel. And this has support for a 160Hz refresh rate at the native resolution and has dual mode functionality, allowing it to run up to 320Hz at 1920 by 1080 or the Full HD 1080p resolution. The screen size and resolution combination gives a really nice tight pixel density, so you get a really nice crisp look to text and suitably high resolution image content, and that would include games. So we'll show you some gameplay, but if you're interested in learning a bit more about this resolution on a screen of this size, then check out the article which is linked to in the video description. But anyway, crisp look, nice clarity, and I'm using no scaling at the moment. I'm used to that, I've got myself used to that, but everything is tiny. Most people are going to want to use some degree of scaling, and if you do that, things will look bigger. But most applications on Windows now will scale cleanly, which means you still benefit from the tight pixel density, so things retain that nice crisp look, they're just bigger. I'm now going to cover the refresh rate supported by the monitor and some associated attributes. So starting off with DisplayPort connection, you've got up to the 4K UHD resolution at 160Hz, and the monitor supports 10 bits per channel at the same time, and you can use HDR and VRR at the same time as all of this as well. So DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC, which is used more specifically, and you can disable DSC on the screen. That's something you might want to do if you're using an older GPU generation such as the RTX 40 series, I know, or older, and wish to access the NVIDIA features DSR and DLDSR. With DSC disabled via DisplayPort, you're limited to a maximum of 60Hz if you want to use a full range RGB signal at the native resolution, or up to 160Hz there if you're happy to use a limited range signal. This list just shows a few additional refresh rates supported via DisplayPort at the 4K UHD resolution. The monitor also includes full bandwidth 48 gigabits per second HDMI 2.1 ports, and with this you get the 4K UHD resolution up to 160Hz with 12 bits per channel. As usual, be aware that most content is not 12 bits. There's really a very slim range of content which will actually make use of this, so don't think that you're getting an advantage by selecting 12 bits and using HDMI 2.1 over DisplayPort for that reason. But if you do happen to create your own content, or you know you're viewing 12-bit content, this can be advantageous. And as with DisplayPort, you get HDR and VRR support at the same time as all of this if you wish. The monitor also supports HDMI 2.1 VRR, which would be used, for example, by the PS5, which doesn't support adaptive sync. Here are some additional refresh rates supported via HDMI at the 4K UHD resolution. You'll see it also includes a 24Hz mode, which some people like to use for movie content. As with DisplayPort, you can disable DSC via HDMI if you wish. With that, you do actually get a higher bandwidth than via DisplayPort with DSC disabled. And you can run up to 160Hz 10 bits with a full range RGB signal. So this is certainly the preferred choice if you wish to disable DSC and your GPU supports HDMI 2.1. The monitor also has dual mode functionality, which you can use via DisplayPort and HDMI. And that allows it to run at the Full HD resolution 1920 by 1080, 1080p, at up to 320Hz, which is double the usual refresh rate. I'm on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about the scaling capabilities of this screen. The monitor can use an interpolation process to display non-native resolutions. I'm running the native resolution at the moment, so there isn't any of that going on. I've switched over to 2560 by 1440, 1440p or QHD resolution now. The monitor does support scaling there at up to 160Hz. And things look a little bit softer than I'd expect for a QHD screen of this size. There are a few ways to offset this. First of all, there's a super resolution control in gaming. Increasing this sharpens the image up a lot, actually it over sharpens the image a lot. It looks almost like there's a strange foil applied to the screen, like a weird filter effect. Even if you just increase this to a setting of 1, it really does look a bit over sharpened and weird to my eye. Some people might find this fine and quite like it, but for me, at least with the QHD resolution, I don't like this so much. There's also a sharpness control if you go into the preset you're using. It's set to 5 by default. And you can increase this. It gives a gentler increase in sharpness without looking as obviously over sharpened and weird. I think for the QHD resolution you can probably get away with maybe increasing this all the way up to 8 if you want. and that gives quite a nice representation in my view. And you might want to use a different preset for the non-native resolution, as you might be wanting to use different sharpness settings, so just be aware that you can do that on this monitor. I've reset all the sharpness controls to the default. I'm running the full HD resolution at 160Hz. I'm not using the dual mode at the moment, so 160Hz is the maximum I can use without using that dual mode switch. Things again look moderately soft compared to what I'd expect for a 27-inch full HD screen. So yes, as with QHD, I don't like super resolution. It over sharpens and makes things look weird. But I think the sharpness control, again set to 8, works pretty well. You might even want to go a little bit higher at this resolution, maybe up to 9 or 10. It's up to you. It's very personal preference, really. But just for now, I'm going to return to the default sharpness. Not really obvious on the video either way, so it doesn't matter too much. I just want to make you aware of what I'm using right now. There's also a display mode setting in gaming, which are your scaling options. So there's full and aspect. And full is the default option, and that uses all pixels of the screen, regardless of the resolution you've selected. Aspect instead respects the aspect ratio of the source resolution. It'll give you a black border if needed, rather than stretching and distorting the image if the aspect ratio doesn't match the actual monitor aspect ratio of 16:9. If you disable VRR, additional options are available. And that includes 1:1, which is a pixel mapping setting, so that only uses the pixels called for by the source resolution. So I've selected Full HD, remember, at the moment, so it's only using 1920 by 1080 pixels on the screen, and it has the image in the central region at the bottom, and the rest of the screen is filled with black. There are also various screen size emulation modes. I'm not going to go through all of these, I just want to show you what's available. There's 22-inch 16:10, 23-inch 16:9, 23.6-inch 16:9, and 24-inch 16:9. These settings can be used at the native resolution as well as lower resolutions such as QHD or Full HD, which I'm using at the moment. Just be aware, again, you do need to have VRR disabled to access these. Regardless of whether you're using the native resolution, QHD or Full HD, the image is scaled using these settings, which softens the image up a bit. Again, you can offset this to a degree by using the sharpness settings of the monitor, but things will never look quite like they would on a native 24-inch screen at whatever resolution you're using. I've just returned to showing full screen Full HD on the monitor at 160Hz. The screen does have a dual mode feature, which allows it to run at double the refresh rate, 320Hz, for the Full HD 1920 by 1080 or 1080p resolution. So you can just press that dedicated button a few times to the right of the joystick and it'll switch to its dual mode feature. It did say you shouldn't do this when you're in game, and this is the reason why, because it will sort of minimize the game, but you can just get back into it. Get back into the game. This is a little bit disruptive, so it takes a little bit of time, but other than that, it's fine. It's now running its dual mode. So you might notice the OSD is scaled up a lot larger, and it's running the Full HD resolution. And another thing is, you might notice it says 160Hz at the top, but that's only because I haven't selected 320Hz in the game. And if you're running the game full screen like I was, you do actually have to quit it and reopen the game so that it reacquires your list of available resolutions and refresh rates, otherwise you won't be able to select 320Hz. If you're not running exclusive full screen, it should be okay, because it should be able to just switch more smoothly, but that's another reason it says to quit the game when you're switching to dual mode. Anyhow, got it all set up now using 320Hz, so this is the dual mode functionality working at its full capacity. And with this dual mode setting active, the image appears different to using its usual interpolation process. It almost has an interlaced appearance to the edges of objects, to text and also fine edges. It's what I'd describe as a slightly softened staircase fringe, I guess. It almost looks like a softened and filtered version of integer scaling. And this weird appearance, I would say actually, if you're sitting some distance from the monitor, it actually looks quite nice. It looks like quite good Full HD representation, really. And by some distance, I mean, that really depends on your eyesight and just how you view things, really. But if you're sitting back, let's say, I don't know, 90 centimeters or more, it's probably going to look pretty good. But my usual viewing distance is around 70 centimeters from the screen, and to me it does look quite weird with this dual mode feature and the way it uses its interpolation, so bear in mind that your mileage may vary. Either way though, the weird appearance, it can't be overcome using the sharpness or super resolution controls, and I find they can actually make it worse. So I prefer just leaving it all at default when I'm using this setting. And what I'm going to do now is just zoom in massively to try and show you that sort of staircasey effect, that interlaced look that it has. Again, this is sort of like a filtered version of integer scaling. It doesn't look like GPU level integer scaling, which would look sharper. So that's just to get your eye in. This is with the dual mode. I'm going to switch over to the usual interpolation process in the normal mode of the monitor just to see if you can see a difference there. So now things look basically smoother. It doesn't have that staircase effect. Of course, you won't be pixel peeping like this when you're just using the monitor normally. But still, as I said, I did find it noticeable for my usual viewing distance eyes around 70 centimeters from the screen. Individual experiences with this will vary. Some people won't mind it. And as I said, I did find the image quite good if I was sitting further back. And either way, the dual mode function is designed for speed, which I'll be exploring later, over image quality. I'm now going to cover the external features of the monitor. I've actually left the monitor plugged in for a change. So that's just so I can show you the power LED, because it's quite an interesting design I found. Just this very thin strip style white LED beneath the Gigabyte logo. It's flashing at the moment because the screen's on standby, my system's off. It would be constantly illuminated when the monitor's on, but if you don't like that, you can turn it off in the OSD, so that's not an issue. I like the stand design. This has been shared with a few of Gigabyte's other recent models. It's coated metal for the base and the neck. Has a nice slender neck design, a low profile base, doesn't take up a lot of desk depth, and it has quite a premium feel to it, I find, and the overall monitor does as well. I mean, it's got a little bit of wobble to it, but not a huge amount. The screen has your usual dual stage bezel design, so it has a thin panel border flush with the rest of the screen, as well as a slim hard plastic outer component to the bezel. And that panel border is difficult to see when the screen's switched off as it is now. It's clearer when the monitor's switched on. Coming back to that Gigabyte logo, I should have mentioned before, you might have noticed anyway, it's actually glossy. The rest of the bottom bezel, it's matte black plastic, which makes sense, it's quite normal, just sort of sits there, unobtrusive. But this glossy element, I'm not a huge fan of it personally. I don't mind it too much because it's quite a small element, but I don't really see why they made that glossy. I prefer a more subdued look for the logo element of monitors personally. Oh, and beneath that Gigabyte logo, you've got your OSD controls as well as 2 shortcut keys, which you can configure in the OSD. The screen surface is what I would classify as light to very light matte anti-glare. So that means you can get some sharper glare patches if there's strong direct light. There is strong direct light striking the screen there. So you get this kind of glassy appearance, sharper glare patches. It still offers good overall glare handling, not as good as some matte anti-glare screen surfaces. It doesn't diffuse the glare as heavily. And I explore the screen surface a little bit more in the contrast section. The stand's fully adjustable, so this is at the lowest stand height, really nice and low to the desk, and get maybe one finger under there. This is the crude measurement method I like to use in my reviews for showing you how close the bottom of the monitor gets to the desk. And also the central logo underhangs a little bit more. And that's at the highest stand height. So there's 130mm or 5.12 inches of height adjustment. You can also tilt the screen, you can swivel it left and right, and you can rotate it 90 degrees into portrait. At the rear, mainly matte black plastic, except for the coated metal stand neck, and a few glossy elements, like a strip that runs through the centre of the monitor horizontally, and also a little logo there. It has a kind of holographic effect, so it looks like Gigabyte from there, gaming from there. Kind of cool, I guess, but not something that you'll generally notice when you're just using the monitor, like a normal person. The stand attaches centrally using a quick release mechanism, so you push that little lever or catch up, and then you can remove the screen from the stand, and that will reveal provision for 100 by 100mm VESA mounting. There's a case lock to the right there. The ports face downwards. You've got an AC power input, so the monitor has an internal power converter. You've got 2 HDMI 2.1 ports. These are full bandwidth 48 gigabits per second ports. DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC. You've got a USB-C port with 18 watts of power delivery, DisplayPort Alt Mode, and upstream data. You have a USB-B port and 3 USB 3.2 Gen 1 ports. So the monitor has KVM functionality, which allows you to share USB peripherals between multiple systems and quickly switch display inputs. And you can use the OSD shortcut key style system to do that easily and quickly. And there's a 3.5mm headphone jack. There are also 2 5-watt speakers integrated into the screen. These offer nice volume control. It can go nice and quiet, so if you like to have the screen on very quietly in the evening, or when you just want to listen to things yourself and not disturb other family members, you can do that. It can also go fairly loud. It has reasonably rich sound output. It's not super amazing. I mean, 2 5-watt speakers, it's not going to keep audiophiles too happy, and it doesn't give you an incredible lush sound or anything like that. But it is reasonably rich. It's better than some integrated monitor speakers at least, so they're there if you want to use them. Before moving on with the rest of the review, I'd like to talk about dynamic interlace pattern artifacts, or what some users will call inversion artifacts or scan lines. This is whereby some shades can appear to break up into an interlaced pattern of lines of a brighter and darker variant of the intended shade, which appear to move as you scan your eyes across the screen or observe motion. Now, I didn't notice, shall we say, conventional interlace pattern artifacts on this monitor, thankfully, but I did sometimes notice a faint moire pattern, or moire or moire, however you want to say it, or an interference pattern of radial lines when observing bright content on the monitor, mainly towards the right side. They sometimes caught my eye when I was moving my head or observing certain moving content with a large flat light shade such as white as a background. I've captured the sort of thing you might see the best I could with a camera, but to the eye it is much fainter than this. And the camera adds some of its own extra artifacts which you wouldn't observe in person. They were very faintly visible when the movement of my head or content stopped and I looked very carefully. And this only occurs at certain viewing distances, but this generally coincided with my usual viewing distance with my eyes around 70 centimeters from the screen. I could see them regardless of refresh rate, VRR status, or how the monitor was set up. I consider them very faint and they're undistracting in my view. I didn't actually notice them at all for quite a while after starting the review. So I just wanted to mention them here for completeness, even though I think that most people, they're not going to find them distracting or necessarily notice them at all. And it could even be a specific issue with my unit, I'm not sure. Moving on now to the subpixels of the screen. Normal RGB stripe layout. There are no issues related to odd subpixel layouts on this screen which would affect text clarity or fine edge clarity, so you don't need to run through ClearType as a Windows user, although you might wish to run through the wizard and just adjust according to your own preferences. Now I'm going to explore the calibration of the monitor. So the table here shows various central average gamma readings taken using a Gigabyte colorimeter and white point readings taken using a data color colorimeter. So out of the box, the monitor showed a slightly cool tint, but not too strong, and a bit of green weakness, but this is only a slight green weakness. That is to say that the balance of the green channel is a little bit below the red and the blue. The monitor has an sRGB mode, an sRGB emulation setting, just called sRGB on the monitor, and with that the average gamma is 2.15, although the tracking is a bit different and I'll explore that in more detail shortly. The white point is quite good in terms of the red and blue, although there's a little bit of a green weakness. Again, it's just a slight green weakness, it's not super obvious to the eye or anything like that, but the colorimeter did pick this up. If you set the color temperature to user and have all of the color channels at the neutral position, then you get a very cool white point, nearly 8200K, so a really obvious icy blue tint to everything. There's a color temperature warm setting, which is really the opposite of that, and that gives a nice warm amber tint to the image. I say nice, it depends what you're after really, but this is an effective low blue light setting, which I think is quite well balanced visually. Yes, it looks warm, it looks amber, but it doesn't have this weird green or yellow tint to it like some low blue light settings, and it's certainly effective in the sense that it reduces blue light output from the monitor. Anyway, it's something that some of you might want to explore for viewing comfort, perhaps in the evenings, for example. And under my test settings, I was able to get close to the 2.2 average gamma, again, very similar to out-of-the-box performance here, and close to the 6500K white point without that slight green channel weakness. In the second table, that shows how I set everything up on the monitor. If you're interested in learning a bit more about this, then check out the best settings video, where I go through these settings. As noted there, individual units and preferences vary. These won't be optimal in all cases. ICC profiles aren't used in the review, but I have included one created using the test settings in the description of the video if you wish to try it out. This shows the gamma using my test settings, which was very similar to the gamma tracking straight out of the box. And the deviations from the desired 2.2 are minor for the most part. The most noteworthy deviation here, that's for the darkest shade measured, 2% grey, where gamma falls below 1.9. And that means that shades at this grey level can appear brighter than intended. It isn't a widespread over-brightening, it only affects shades within a tight range. It didn't give dark areas in games or movies an obvious uplifted look. Using the sRGB mode switches from a linear 2.2 gamma target to sRGB gamma, as you can see in this graph. So there's a progressive reduction in gamma as shades become darker, which lifts them up significantly and increases how visible and obvious such shades are, and how much they stand out against pure black, for example. It's really personal preference whether linear 2.2 gamma or sRGB gamma tracking is preferred, but it's not unusual for an sRGB emulation setting to include sRGB gamma tracking, and some will like the uplifted look it gives. I also like to explore sRGB colour accuracy using an sRGB emulation setting on the monitor, and that's what's done here. This is using the Spider Checker 48 test patch. As usual, shade 1F cerulean, that's the highest error. It's always the outlier, just that the colorimeter is very sensitive to the balance of blue and green here, and it picks things up very readily. But even so, the average delta E 0.95, that is a good result here. Looking now at the contrast and brightness performance of the monitor, this table here shows various readings, or more specifically white and black luminance readings, and then a contrast ratio was calculated from these. So the monitor reaches a peak brightness here under SDR of 462 nits, and that's with all of the colour channels at the neutral position, which as I mentioned before gives a very cool tint to things. But using the standard settings at 100% brightness, you get 387 nits, which is still fairly bright and certainly bright enough for most people. The contrast ratio generally sits around 1100 to 1, although with all of the colour channels at the neutral position, it's closer to 1300 to 1. Under my test settings with the adjustments made there, the contrast ratio sat at 1107 to 1. I'm on Shadow of the Tomb Raider now, and I'm going to explore contrast using some in-game examples. So of course, at a little bit above 1000 to 1, contrast certainly isn't a big strength of this monitor by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, it has a little bit of extra sort of depth and inkiness, if you like to use those terms, compared to some IPS models, but really this is a very average performance. There's also a moderate amount of IPS glow, and that can be brought out more strongly if you're sitting closer to the screen, if you're using a high brightness setting on the monitor, and if your unit has an issue with backlight bleed or clouding. My one does have quite a bit of clouding in places. That's not an unusual amount, but certainly some. And it's strongest towards the top left. So this can give a sort of foggy appearance to darker shades, and certainly in scenes like this, and you're sitting in a darker room, then the depth and atmosphere just isn't there. But there are some strengths to IPS panels like this compared to, for example, VA LCDs and certainly TN LCDs, and that's gamma consistency. It's quite strong. So aside from the regions affected by IPS glow, you get quite a consistent look to your detail levels. So the gamma in the center of the screen is fairly similar to what you'll perceive at the edges of the screen. There's no black crush centrally like you get on a VA model, and excessive detail peripherally as you might get on a VA model, and there aren't the kind of vertical detail gradients you'd get on a TN model. But I know I've been testing quite a few OLEDs recently, and in a dark room things just do not compare. I've now brightened things up quite a bit, and you can see quite a bit of glare on the screen. So it's not diffused as heavily as on some screens, which is why you can see these sort of sharper glare patches, or what I would describe as a bit of a glassy appearance sometimes. Not the same as a glossy screen surface, of course, but certainly different to some matte screen surfaces. This is the light to very light matte quality in play here. But with these brighter conditions in the room, it does take the edge off the weaknesses in contrast. It isn't as apparent. So it's just something to be aware of, that if you are sitting in a dark room, you might want to try and at least have some light behind the monitor, like a bias light or something like that. Not only could that improve your perceived contrast experience, it could also improve viewing comfort. And this screen surface, with the fact that it's not diffusing light as heavily as some, yes, you get these glare patches. It depends on the lighting. This is a reasonably bright room. But if it's more strongly diffused across the screen, then it gives quite a hazy appearance to the image as well. So light from the room competes with the image in a way where it's diffused across the screen and it just hazes everything up. So that doesn't happen as much with this kind of screen surface compared to a stronger matte screen surface. The other thing is that there's not as much layering in front of the screen, so it doesn't look like the image is sort of displaced far back, and there's not this sort of smeariness in front of the screen as you get with some matte screen surfaces. There is a little bit of graininess. It's what I describe as a light, misty graininess though, which I can observe, particularly if you're observing medium to bright shades. You might notice this kind of thing if you're sensitive to it like I am. But the level of graininess here, I'd say it's on the lower end really for a matte screen surface, so most people aren't going to be bothered by it. I'm going to look now at the colour reproduction, starting off with Lagom.nl and the test for viewing angles, to talk about colour consistency, and that's the concept of how similar a colour might appear centrally versus elsewhere on the screen. The Lagom text appears quite blended throughout the screen. There's a little bit of an orangey look in places, a little bit of a green tint in places, but there aren't strong shifts between red and orange, so this indicates a relatively low viewing angle dependency to the gamma curve of the monitor. You might also notice a shadowy look towards the edges and particularly corners of the screen. This is a bit of a vignetting effect. It is exaggerated on the camera, and it depends how close you're sitting to the monitor. For my normal viewing position, eyes around 70 centimeters from the screen, it certainly isn't as strong as it appears in the video here, but it is something to be aware of if you like to sit quite close to your monitors. I wouldn't say the monitor's particularly bad in this respect for an IPS model even. I mean, I've certainly used some which are worse, some which are a bit better than this though. Things just look bizarre in the video for this particular shade, but it looks more consistent than it appears in the video. It's a pinkish purple throughout the screen. Yes, there are some slight shifts if you move your eye to the pink versus purple hue, but it really doesn't appear at all like it does in the video. There's this pink orb in the centre of the screen surrounded by a bluish purple. The red block that appears a nice rich red throughout the screen. Again, you can see some slight vignetting, but it is exaggerated in the video. More of the same with the green block, good green chartreuse throughout the screen, a little bit darker towards the peripheral regions of the screen. Again, not like it appears in the video. The blue block, that's a good rich royal blue throughout the screen. I'm going to explore colour in more detail now, primarily using in-game examples. The gamut of the monitor, the native gamut, I measured 122.1% sRGB volume. Remember that the colourful line shows the monitor and the dotted line shows the reference colour space, sRGB in this case. The overextension here, it's mainly skewed towards the red region, but it isn't extreme. If you compare to the DCI-P3 colour space, I recorded 85.9% DCI-P3 coverage, and for those interested, 78.8% Adobe RGB. The gamut's really a bit of an intermediate one between sRGB and DCI-P3, except towards the blue region where it extends beyond DCI-P3 even. Overall, it certainly isn't as wide as some wide gamut monitors I've looked at recently. And the gamut isn't quite as wide as I would have expected given the specifications of the monitor. There can be a degree of inter-unit variation, and the coverage recorded depends on the measurement standard as well as the instrument and software used. I got similar coverage across multiple software packages using both my Datacolor and Calibrite colorimeters though. I'm now on Battlefield 2042 and I'm going to talk about colour reproduction using some in-game examples. If you're running a game under SDR as I am now, you're just on the desktop, you're not in a colour managed environment, watching a movie, something like that, then you can expect extra saturation and extra vibrancy when you're using this full native gamut of the monitor. So with this scene here, the sky blues look a bit more lively than they should, although the extension in the cyan region isn't extreme and it doesn't really give this sort of cartoonish look to the sky which you can get with some monitors. There's definitely extra punch to some of the green shades. The earthy browns have a bit of a red tint to them, and you can see the same with skin tones. It isn't extreme though. Again, the extension in the gamut isn't extreme here. Some blue and purple shades look quite lively though, as you'd expect from the gamut. There aren't really any good examples of those in this particular scene, but you just can see it from time to time. If you prefer to tone things down, looking more as the developers intend, you might say, within the constraints of the sRGB colour space, the monitor does offer an sRGB emulation setting. To switch picture over to sRGB, you can adjust the brightness, but quite a few other settings are blocked off, including your colour channels and your gamma control, as well as sharpness for that matter. So I can clearly see that all of those elements I was talking about before, they're toned down a lot now. The gamut now looks like this. I recorded 98.5% sRGB coverage, and there isn't significant extension beyond sRGB, so it is an effective sRGB gamut clamp. Remember that if you wanted this kind of look to things, but you wanted more flexibility on the monitor side, you could leave it on the custom setting or another preset that isn't sRGB, and then use GPU level emulation, sRGB emulation instead. For example, you could use Windows ACM. You can learn more about that in the article linked to in the video description. Just be aware what you definitely don't want to do is you don't want to be using the sRGB setting and using GPU level gamut clamping such as Windows ACM. And remember, Windows ACM is a bit sneaky. It might activate without you actually realizing. For example, if you change to 10-bit color in NVIDIA control panel, it can just activate itself then. So you do have to be careful about this. Just switched back over to my test settings using the full native gamut. So the potential here within the sRGB color space is very good. Less potential within extended colour spaces such as DCI-P3 and definitely Adobe RGB. But with a relatively strong colour consistency, you do get quite good potential if you want to use this monitor for colour critical work, again being aware of some of the gamut limitations in places. As usual, best results will be from calibrating your monitor with your own colorimeter, although that isn't going to give you a wider gamut than the monitor supports. I'd also just like to quickly take a look at off-angle viewing angle performance as well. So you can certainly see as you go off angle vertically, things dim, things get hazy, it's a loss of contrast. I'd say pretty typical for an IPS model. And more of the same horizontally, certainly weaker horizontal viewing angles than some IPS models I've used. It's going to be difficult to capture this with the camera, but by eye, you can definitely see a fair loss of contrast, even if you just go slightly off angle. I'm now going to quickly cover HDR on the monitor, and I mean quickly because I want to respect your time as well as my own time. This monitor is really very incapable from the hardware side when it comes to HDR. The backlight just stays at a constant level. You can change the brightness if you want. I explore this in the best settings video. Depends on what HDR setting you're using, but there's no local dimmings. So if you reduce the brightness, then it's just like you're reducing the brightness under SDR. You reduce your brightness level for the brightest shades as well as the darker shades. So using the full brightness of the monitor as I am now with the regular HDR setting, a brightness of 489 nits was recorded and similar contrast to SDR. Again, no local dimming and also no dynamic contrasts used. So in this scene here, for the more colourful elements, it looks okay, although there's definitely a lack of depth in places, mainly because of the lack of dimming precision. And when you look at shadowy areas like that, I mean, you can see IPS glow, you can see an uplifted foggy look. It doesn't look like it should under HDR at all. I suppose if higher brightness than SDR is the main thing you're concerned about, then the HDR mode can deliver that, as you're getting 489 nits, which is higher than SDR, even if you had the colour channels unlocked under SDR and got the really cool tint. And you're not getting a really cool tint under HDR to achieve that brightness either. The colour channel controls are locked under HDR, and I recorded 6800K, so it is slightly cool, but not super cool. And there's a well-balanced green channel as well. The colour reproduction side, just in general. The gamut I recorded, it's not really amazing by HDR standards, certainly incomplete DCI-P3 coverage and below 70% Rec 2020. So for these wider gamuts which are ideally targeted under HDR, it doesn't work as well as it could. And for this scene here, I mean, things don't look washed out in the colour department because there's an obvious lack of saturation or anything like that. There's still quite decent saturation levels, and because the developers can target wider gamuts like DCI-P3 and Rec 2020, it doesn't give you that kind of universally oversaturated look that using the full native gamut under SDR would give you. So Laura's skin, for example, it doesn't look overdone, but there are some nice lush looking green shades, some of which go beyond the sRGB colour space. Same with her dress here. Some very reasonable lashings of vibrancy. The terracotta-y red pillars there as well look quite nice. But again, better dimming precision would have helped add some extra depth here, and a more generous gamut would also help. But I do think they've done quite a good job with the gamut that they do have available, because they haven't completely overdone the saturation levels. So it's not like on some monitors where it just purposefully oversaturates things and things look artificially boosted, nor does it look washed out because they've failed to use the gamut properly. So as I would usually say on monitors with an HDR level like this is VISA Display HDR 400 certified, by the way. Barely bothered even mentioning that because it's not really something to write home about. Anyway, as I usually say, it does give you a different look to things, and it can be nice for a bit of variety from time to time, but I think your bread and butter on this monitor is probably going to be using SDR, where you get more control over the settings, and I think most people are just going to find the look under SDR a bit better. And certainly if you're used to proper looking HDR, you can't help but be a bit disappointed by how things look here under HDR. Not take away anything if you want to use it from time to time for a different look to things, but don't think that it's something you're always going to be wanting to use on this monitor. We're going to look now at the responsiveness of the monitor, starting out with some pursuit photographs at 160Hz, which is the maximum refresh rate for the normal mode of the monitor. If you're not familiar with pursuit photographs or any of the other terminology I'm using in this section, be sure to check out the responsiveness article, which is linked to in the video description. So you can see here, various different overdrive settings are used. Off being a typical overdrive off experience, or sort of native panel performance really. So there you can see quite a bit of powdery trailing behind the UFOs, indicating some weaknesses in pixel responsiveness. The picture quality setting cleans this up a bit without adding a lot of additional overshoot. Smart OD takes things further, and actually Smart OD and balance at this refresh rate for these transitions at least appears very similar. I will be exploring this in a little bit more detail shortly. Speed, on the other hand, that really pushes things up too far and adds a lot of overshoots. There's a lot of bright halo trailing and verse ghosting behind the UFOs, bright and colourful. It's very eye-catching in practice, so the speed setting's pretty useless. I've also included a reference screen at the end. That's the MSI MPG274URF-QD. At least for the transitions shown here, that performs quite similarly to the Gigabyte with its picture quality setting. For those preferring some figures, here are some figures. These were taken with the OSRTT Pro tool, which is the same tool and the same methodology used by TFT Central, although they use their own colour coding system. There's quite a lot of data to get through here, so I'll try and be quite quick. You can see that the average initial time is 5.58 milliseconds, but this is with the overdrive set to off, so there's no overshoot recorded here, and moderately slow pixel responses. Bumping up to picture quality, that improves the average initial time from 5.58 milliseconds to 3.93 milliseconds. You can see there's more green on the table now. That's good to see. There is some overshoot though. Not a huge amount of overshoot, but just a bit in places. Red on the graph for some transitions, but overall not too bad. The Smart OD setting now, that speeds things up a little bit from 3.93 to 3.73 for the average initial time, so not a huge difference, although there is quite a bit of extra overshoot now. So this is a setting which some might like, but if you're particularly sensitive to overshoot, it might be worth sticking to picture quality. Of course, you'll have to consider things at other refresh rates as well, and I will be doing that later in the review. The balance setting now is actually very similar to the Smart OD setting. Really, any differences are within the margin of error for the testing instrument in this test anyway. So it might be interesting to revisit that reference screen, the MSI MPG 274URF QD, which I referenced with the pursuit photographs. So comparing the Gigabyte with its Smart OD setting at 160Hz to the MSI using its fast setting, which is the optimal setting there. You can see that the Gigabyte's a little bit faster, 3.73 versus 4.24 for the average initial time, but that does come at the expense of more overshoot. Again, if you are sensitive to overshoot, you could consider the picture quality setting of the Gigabyte. And with that, you're basically going to get overshoot levels somewhere between the Gigabyte shown here and the MSI shown here. The speed setting then, at 160Hz, this offers a bit of an improvement in speed. So you're down from 3.73 milliseconds using Smart OD to 3 milliseconds on the dot as the average initial time, but that does come at the expense of much stronger overshoot. There's a lot more red on the graph now, and that is certainly noticeable to the eye. I'm now on Battlefield 5, and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness using some in-game examples. I'm running the game at 160 frames a second, so I'm making the most out of the 160Hz refresh rate. This really just reflects what I was showing you with the objective data before, in that there is a little bit of overshoot in places, so I can see it behind the tree and around the walls with the bright sky in the background, but this isn't in your face super obvious striking overshoot like you would get with the speed setting, for example. I'm using Smart OD at the moment, and I can certainly see a bit of an inky look here to the overshoot. It's probably the most obvious example in this scene is just to the left of the wall here. You might not be able to see it in the video so obviously, but it does catch my eye a little bit because I'm quite sensitive to this. And if you are, you could consider picture quality to tone things down a little bit, but I really don't think that most people are going to have a problem with Smart OD because the overshoot levels aren't extreme. And in terms of the pixel responses, yeah, it's a pretty competent IPS performance. It's certainly a fast IPS model. The weaknesses are on the minor side, really. You get a bit of powdery trailing in places. So the structure of the brickwork or the stonework here, a little bit of perceived blur there, which ideally wouldn't be there and you wouldn't get on an OLED, for example, but not an extreme amount. And there's nothing which I'd describe as smeary trailing or even heavy powdery trailing. So just slight weaknesses in places, nothing extreme. Another advantage with this 160Hz, 160 frames a second experience is a nice level of connected feel. That's also aided by low input lag. On this monitor, I measured 1.73 milliseconds of input lag, which is a nice low level. It indicates a very low signal delay, which is the main element of input lag you feel. And that means there's a nice level of connectedness when you're interacting with your game world. Moving on to another scene now. This one has a lot of high contrast transitions, so there are contrasting elements where you've got some very dark shades against medium and light shades and vice versa. And these kind of transitions, LCDs do typically struggle a bit more with. This is where there was a little bit of red on the graph, even using some of the faster response time settings, like Smart OD as I'm using now. There isn't any extreme weakness even here, no smeary trailing or really any heavy powdery trailing. The trailing is just a little bit more noticeable than it was in the other scene, and adds a slight mask of extra perceived blur. I can see it in the background there with the rock textures a little bit as well, but I do stress that this is quite minor, and I've been using a lot of OLEDs recently, and it's something I'm very sensitive to. And if you're not used to playing on an OLED, it might not be something you'll actually notice at all, because these are minor weaknesses, really. And again, there's a bit of overshoot in places, but nothing too striking. You might remember on my reviews, I often like to talk a little bit about dirty trailing overshoot or dark trailing, shadowy trailing. There's often a bit of that around the light here with the grey sky in the background. There is a little bit here, but it really doesn't jump out, so that's good to see, or not see. As I explored earlier in the review, there is a dual mode function, which means you can run the monitor at double the refresh rate, 320Hz, at the full HD 1080p resolution. The speed setting is perhaps a bit more usable in the sense that the overshoot isn't as extreme now, but it's still quite strong, and for some transitions not shown here I did find it a bit too eye-catching. I'd personally use Smart OD here, which I think gives a nice level of acceleration, which of course I'll look at in a little bit more detail, some figures very shortly. But you can see from the clarity of the main object that it is improved, it is sharpened up a bit, things are just a bit more sharply focused because of the increase in refresh rate. Although the weaknesses and pixel responses, in addition to a bit of trailing behind the UFOs, there is a bit of added perceived blur internally as well, which means that the details aren't quite as crisp as they could be. So if you compare this to an OLED at this refresh rate, for example, with the OLED you would be seeing sharper internal details, you'd be able to count those little white notches, and also the segmentation of the UFO would just be a bit clearer. So the figures then, this is at the off setting. A weak performance for this refresh rate for sure, but no overshoot. Average initial time 5.6 milliseconds. The picture quality setting does offer a significant improvement, with the average initial time now down to 3.87 milliseconds. Not exactly a stellar performance for 320Hz, but not terrible either, and not very much overshoot. Smart OD speeds things up a little bit, so the average initial time has gone from 3.87 to 3.21 milliseconds, and that does come at the expense of a bit of extra overshoot. Nothing extreme, but just some in places. The balance setting is very slightly faster with just a little bit more overshoot. So the Smart OD setting at 320Hz is like a slightly toned down version of balance, in other words. You've gone from an average initial time of 3.21 milliseconds to 3.1 milliseconds. Average overshoot error has gone from 5.73 to 6.17. The speed setting, that slightly speeds up the average initial time to 3.03 milliseconds. Remember, Smart OD was 3.21 milliseconds, so not actually a massive difference here, and it does come at the expense of a lot more overshoot, so there's a lot of red on the graph now. So in-game at 320Hz, you get a really nice connected feel. The increase in refresh rate and frame rate certainly does make a difference there, so it can be useful for competitive gaming, and also the perceived blur due to eye movement is decreased, and all of this does require that you actually have a frame rate which is suitably high. So if you're just viewing 160 frames a second content at 320Hz, it's not going to do anything useful for you in this respect. You really do have to have significantly higher than 160 frames a second to actually make use of this dual mode functionality and notice a significant difference. The pixel response requirements are increased for 320Hz. You might have noticed that with the figures earlier as well. The powdery trailing I was talking about, it is somewhat more noticeable in places, so it has a bit more of a detrimental impact versus your optimal 320Hz experience. But the monitor still does a pretty good job here. As far as IPS models go, it's quite a good 320Hz performance really. And as I showed you with the figures and the pursuit photographs, overshoot levels are a bit lower. I'm using the Smart OD setting again. So the overshoot, which was never particularly eye-catching, is even less eye-catching now, so most people are going to be very happy again with the Smart OD setting. So on that other scene now, with the higher contrast transitions, again these transitions do show some of the weaker pixel responses that the monitor performs, and that's typical for an IPS model to show this kind of behaviour, but you don't get the kind of smeary trailing you typically get on a VA model. And there's nothing, again, that I'd really describe as heavy powdery trailing. Again, because of the pixel response requirements being higher now, they're essentially doubled at 320Hz versus 160Hz. The weaknesses versus your optimal 320Hz screen without any kind of pixel response time weaknesses, they can be a little bit more noticeable for that reason, but you still overall get a reduction in perceived blur from the increased refresh rate, and the monitor's pixel responses on the whole are good enough to make good use of this refresh rate. So it is nice to be able to use this for competitive gaming. Remember again that you do need to have a high frame rate to actually make good use of this. And there aren't any particular issues of note with overshoot in this scene. That slight dirty trailing I was observing before is less noticeable now than it was at 160Hz, reflecting the overall slightly lower overshoot which I showed you objectively as well. The one supports VRR variable refresh rate technologies, including AMD FreeSync Premium. You can also use NVIDIA G-Sync compatible, and you can use HDMI 2.1 VRR, which would be applicable on the PS5, for example, which doesn't support adaptive sync. The range of operation is 48 to 160Hz and below 48Hz or 48 frames a second for your content. LFC low frame rate compensation is used, so the monitor sticks to a multiple of the frame rate with its refresh rate to keep tearing and stuttering at bay. And VRR all works as you'd hope on this monitor. I didn't observe any issues with flickering or anything like that, so no VRR flickering observed. As usual, there was a little bit of stuttering when the LFC boundary is crossed. That's not specific to this monitor, it's something which I always observe. It's more subtle than the kind of stuttering you'd usually observe observed if you're not using VRR at all. So most people will find this okay, and it's fine as long as you're not frequently passing the LFC boundary anyway. So I've got the game running at 120 frames a second, the monitor's matching that with its 120Hz refresh rate. It does indeed get rid of tearing and stuttering, and there's not a sudden increase in overshoot or anything like that. I'm still using the Smart OD setting, so really the overall 120Hz experience is quite pleasant on this monitor. At least visually it gives a good level of acceleration without excessive overshoot. There is naturally an increase in perceived blur and reduction in connected field just because of the lower frame rate. So here are some pursuit photographs at 120Hz. You can again see that Smart OD and balance for these transitions look quite similar. Picture quality is again worth considering if you prefer slightly lower levels of overshoot and don't mind sacrificing a bit of pixel response speed. The reference screen, I'd say it's kind of like picture quality, but actually lower in terms of overshoot. So the MSI is arguably a bit better tuned for 120Hz, although the difference isn't necessarily going to be huge or really noticeable in practice for most people. You might notice there isn't a speed setting now. That's because that's only available at 144Hz and above. So some figures now. Average initial time using the off setting for overdrive, 5.62. So an okay 120Hz performance, even using just the panel native performance really, and no overshoot recorded here. Bumping up to picture quality, you go from 5.62 to 4.39 milliseconds for your average initial time, so a bit of an improvement there. A pretty competent 120Hz performance now, a little bit of overshoot in places, but it's on the lower end overall. The Smart OD setting, that gets the average initial time from 4.39 to 3.92 milliseconds, so there's a nice little bump up in speed now. And that does come at the expense of a bit of additional overshoot, but it's not extreme. It's still moderate overshoot in places, but it's not too bad. It's going to be perfectly tolerable for most people. The balance setting, that speeds things up a little bit, so from 3.92 to 3.44 milliseconds, but it does come at the expense of more overshoot. The average error has gone up from 8.33 to 9.17, and the worst error from 28 to 32. With percentage above 10 RGB going from 33.33 to 40. So basically there's more red on the graph now. There are more transitions which show strong and potentially quite noticeable overshoot. So with all of this, I would actually consider Smart OD gives a good level of acceleration without too much overshoot. I'm running the game at 60 frames a second now. The monitor is running at 60Hz to match that. On some models this would give you a lot of extra overshoot. On this one it's nicely contained, so it doesn't have a lot of extra overshoot. I'm again using the Smart OD setting, which I've been really using throughout the demonstrations I've been giving you in-game, and that's because most people are going to be very happy using this. So I do think that with the Smart OD setting, you can consider this a single overdrive mode experience. And if you do prefer a bit less overshoot, but still want decent pixel responses, you could use the picture quality setting instead. Of course, the perceived blur is significantly increased just because of the lower frame rate, and the connected feel is much worse than it was before. But the monitor doesn't really impart any obvious weaknesses from its pixel responses now. Let's look at that objectively. So here are the pursuit photographs. Based on these particular transitions, you'd probably say that picture quality is optimal in terms of providing a good experience without any real overshoot to speak of, so that's good to see, and that's quite similar to what the reference screen provided. Smart OD and balance appear quite similar here, and there is a bit more overshoot than there is with picture quality. It isn't really extreme eye-catching overshoot, and most people aren't really going to notice it. So to quickly look at some figures, here's the overdrive off experience. Not really too bad for a 60Hz performance, but not exactly optimal either. The average initial time is 5.85 milliseconds. This is decreased using the picture quality setting to 5.04 milliseconds, so things are sped up a little bit, and it doesn't really come at much of an overshoot penalty. Smart OD gives a nice boost from 5.04 to 4.06 milliseconds for your average initial time. It's not like there's an extreme amount of extra overshoot as a consequence either. There is some extra overshoot, but again, it's on the moderate to lower end overall. Balance slightly speeds things up in that it goes from an average initial time of 4.06 to 3.97 milliseconds, so that's only a slight difference, but it does have more widespread overshoot now. There's more red on the graph. That's reflected by the average overshoot error going from 5.6 to 8.67, worst error from 20 to 31, and percent above 10 RGB from 10 to 26.67, which means the stronger overshoot is more widespread, and some transitions just show stronger overshoot than they did before, using the Smart OD setting. The monitor also has a strobe backlight, or what some people might call BFI, black frame insertion setting, called aim stabilizer sync. and that can be used with a refresh rate of 100Hz or above selected, so up to 160Hz normally, or 320Hz if you're using dual mode. The image here shows the clarity it can give to the main object at 160 and 320Hz. So you've got the regular operation of the monitor at each refresh rate using the Smart OD setting, and then you've got aim stabilizer sync with the VRR on and aim stabilizer sync with VRR off. Various settings are restricted, such as brightness and overdrive. The brightness is locked to around 280 nits with VRR on, or around 150 nits with VRR off. If you don't mind sacrificing contrast, you can lower that, and you could get the brightness down to around 60 nits VRR on, or around 30 nits VRR off. As the sync part of the name suggests, and as you'll be able to tell from the images, you can indeed use VRR at the same time. And that's helpful, as you might notice very obvious stuttering if the refresh rate doesn't match the frame rate exactly. And the aim stabilizer sync is able to work with this VRR down to around 75Hz, 75 frames a second, and below that aim stabilizer deactivates and the screen switches to its normal VRR operation. As you can see from the pictures, the setting does work effectively to improve the clarity of the main object at 160Hz and further at 320Hz. It's most effective with VRR off, where the pulse width is shorter, i.e. there's a longer off phase for the strobe, hence lower brightness as well. Repetitions of the object, either in front or behind, can be broadly termed strobe crosstalk. This is lower centrally with VRR disabled, but either way it isn't overly strong in the central region which these particular images are taken from. And remember that it's the central region where your eyes will mainly be focusing when you're playing FPS games. Remember that not all areas of the screen refresh simultaneously, and strobe crosstalk is stronger and potentially easier to notice further up, or in some cases very near the bottom of the screen. And you can see that with this image here. This is at 160Hz, by the way. And that could be a particular issue in strategy games with scrolling text further up or down the screen, or combat flight simulators and that kind of game. The strobe crosstalk is largely similar to what I'm showing you here at 160Hz at low refresh rates as well. VRR is enabled for this image. As I mentioned earlier, the strobe crosstalk is lower with VRR disabled, whereas with VRR enabled, the optimal strobe clarity appears a bit below center. I don't have photos to show whole screen strobe crosstalk with VRR disabled, as frankly, I'd already spent more than enough time taking pursuit photos of the screen. It was getting a bit ridiculous, to be honest. And the whole screen strobe crosstalk images generally take a large number of attempts before you get something usable. I do have another image to show you though, and this is 320Hz. VRR is again enabled. Overall, the strobe crosstalk pattern is similar to 160Hz. Overshoot levels are lower and the strobe crosstalk are smaller repetitions of the object given the high refresh rate. Back to the main image now. Regardless of VRR being on or not, and the refresh rate you're using, you might notice a red or magenta fringe in places. That's related to the slow red phosphor decay for the KSF phosphors used for the backlight of the monitor. It's very common to see this on wide gamut LCD monitors, unless they use a quantum dot LED backlight instead. In this particular example, you can see this fringing quite clearly in front of the UFO with VRR disabled. It's masked a bit by strobe crosstalk with VRR enabled here. In practice, when gaming with the setting, you can also see fringing behind or in front of some objects, which is very obvious to me, at least in some instances. I'm quite sensitive to it. There are additional colourful flashes or colours such as red, magenta and cyan that can be seen in places as well. It's not as extreme as on models with a wider gamut than this. I'm personally quite sensitive to the effect, as you might have guessed, and I don't enjoy this aspect or indeed the colourful fringing. And this all applies both with and without VRR. As usual for such a setting, there's a flickering as the backlight strobes at a frequency matching the refresh rate of the display. Sensitivity to such flickering varies, but there's more potential for this to be bothersome at lower refresh rates, so closer to the 75Hz floor of operation for the setting. If you're frequently passing the 75Hz floor in either direction, then the constant activation and deactivation of aim stabilizer sync would be annoying. So all in all, it's not the cleanest or most flexible strobe backlight implementation out there, but as far as such solutions go on models like this with KSF phosphors for the backlight, it's decent. Some will like to use it, and it's nice that you can use VRR at the same time. To wrap up then, the monitor provided a pretty solid IPS performance really. Reasonable contrast for the panel type, not super impressive but not super weak either. I thought the design was quite nice. I do quite like the stand. Gigabyte seem to be using this one on quite a few of their models. It's all coated metal, the neck and the base, and it has quite a simple design in terms of not taking up a huge amount of desk space. It's quite a low profile design as well. I think it looks quite smart, it feels quite premium, so I'm quite happy with that. Good ergonomics for the monitor as well, so that's nice to see. The colour reproduction characteristics were quite good as well, again, as expected really for the panel type. The gamut wasn't quite as wide as I was expecting given the specifications of the monitor. As I mentioned in the review, there could be a bit of inter-unit variation, a little bit of variation with different instruments and software, although I did confirm this with multiple color emitters and software packages. But with the gamut that is offered, it offers you a bit of extra vibrancy for standard sRGB content without going to extremes like some wide gamut monitors do. So it's a sort of look which actually some people are really going to quite like. And the overall colour consistency was quite strong as expected for an IPS type panel. Gigabyte also calibrated it pretty well, has a good usable sRGB emulation setting. It's quite a restricted sRGB setting though. I would have liked to have seen more options unlocked, although you can adjust the brightness. And of course you could achieve sRGB emulation at the GPU level, but that does rely on generic data which isn't specific to your unit in quite the same way as a well-calibrated sRGB setting could be. The monitor's response performance was good. Competent responsiveness, good single overdrive mode experience, VRR worked without any particular hiccups. The monitor also has a 320Hz mode, dual mode functionality, although I personally wasn't a huge fan of how they did the scaling just visually. This might be something that not everyone will notice in the same way I do, and it does depend on your viewing distance as well. And really the main thing with this 320Hz mode is speed, and the monitor does deliver a competent performance in that respect. Low input lag and respectable fast IPS pixel responses. I don't have too much to say about HDR on the monitor. It really isn't a big selling point, and so it shouldn't be. It's something which you might want to use from time to time for a different look to things, but don't expect anything spectacular. So at some points in the review, when I was talking about responsiveness in particular, I did compare it to the MSI MPG274URF QD, which is a monitor I've reviewed and also liked. So to draw a quick comparison here, the MSI does offer higher USB-C power delivery, 65 watts versus 15 watts for the Gigabyte. It has a superior strobe backlight implementation due to the lack of KSF phosphors, although as far as models with KSF phosphors go, the Gigabyte was actually quite good. It does have a usable strobe backlight implementation and you can use it with VRR at the same time, but you can also do that on the MSI model. But the most important differentiator in my view is the true wide gamut support on the MSI, with excellent Adobe RGB and DCI-P3 coverage, rather than it being restricted to around 90% DCI-P3 if I'm being generous, with far from complete Adobe RGB coverage. This makes it more vibrant and also better for work within extended colour spaces. The Gigabyte has a lower MSRP of $300, whereas the MSI generally sits closer to $400. The Gigabyte also has that dual mode functionality, 320Hz option, which can be nice for some competitive gameplay. So the price to performance ratio of the Gigabyte really is a killer feature, and I do find it easy to recommend given what's on offer here. That is assuming that it is sold at close to the MSRP of $300 because it's not currently available at time of review, but I've been told it should be available very shortly, and that is the target price. So hopefully the retailers will pay attention to that, and once it's available properly, you can really expect this to set the benchmark in terms of price to performance in the 4K UHD segment. That's really all there is to the Gigabyte M27UP. You'll find additional content as well as information about how you can support the work that we do in the description of the video. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they are nice ways of showing your support.